The food service and hospitality industries are evolving, often in ways you've never heard of, until now. Our host and technovator, Rob Grimes, is the leading voice of global food service and hospitality technology. Powered by the International Food and Beverage Technology Association, IFBTA, the Accelerate podcast is where technology and ideas are shared, served with a side of new innovation. Welcome to the Accelerate podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the Accelerate podcast powered by the IFBTA. I'm Rob Grimes, your host, and this week I'm very excited to have a conversation with Terence Ronson. But before we do, let me recap the last couple of episodes. So our last episode was something that we tried called an Accelerate Spotlight, something new for us. And we spotlighted how kiosks and touchscreens, really make their way and what their history was in the industry. And we were joined by MicroTouch's Tyler Wells, who has an interesting perspective. He's not on the sales side, but he really figures out the strategy, and then he works on the partnerships to get it out there. But you got to start with what is the definition of a kiosk. And I would have said they were dead or not had it not been for COVID. But then we talked about touchscreens' roles in kiosks. What is a kiosk? And we really talked about the use cases and opportunities that were out there. So you'll want to listen to that special Accelerate Spotlight with Tyler and with MicroTouch to learn more about the vision and the future on this. And then we also had an episode with Richard Hatter. And Richard, we talked to him from the UK, but spent most of his career in Hong Kong. And he was actually introduced by today's guest, Terence. But the interesting thing about Richard is, besides his role of being a general manager and a strong proponent and person who is listened to in the hospitality industry, he found a way to tie education together with the Hotel Icon, which was a teaching hotel, is part of Hong Kong Polytechnic in Hong Kong, and using it as a lab, both for students as well as technology companies to try new technologies, but also to focus on the area of CSR, corporate social responsibility, which is waste, sustainability, uniforms, AI in uniforms, all kinds of different things. And it was a very interesting perspective, not only on education's role, but the tying the two together, which we've talked about before, of hospitality and tech in Hotel Icon. So you'll certainly want to listen to that as well. And with that, let me introduce today's conversation guest, Terence Ronson, who we're speaking to from the Philippines. And welcome to Accelerate, Terence.
Thanks, Rob. I just want to pick up on something that you said a second ago. In fact, we're not having a cup of coffee. We're thousands of miles apart. It's now Friday evening, my time. The weekend has begun. And just to put it in context, I'm sitting at my home office. In one hand, I've got a nice cold glass of fizzy water. In the other hand, I'm rolling a Cuban cigar between my fingers, waiting for this interview to end so that I can start my weekend.
All right. Well, look, I'm just starting my day because it's early where I'm at. I do have a coffee in my hand, but the cigar actually sounds pretty good. And so we won't want to hold everybody up here. We know you need to get to that. So let's have that conversation. So this is an interesting conversation. It came out of the blue. And I always like to talk about what's the motivation. Why would you even have a conversation? Well, some of you have heard me talk, and I'm going to be interested in Terence's perspective on this, about my experience this year at CES. And when I was there, the American Association of Retired People, AARP, had a booth, which really took me by surprise. And what were they showing? They were showing... Well, I was thinking we were going to call this aging tech, but it's really not aging tech because that would imply that the tech is getting old. Maybe tech for the ages or senior tech. But it gave me a perspective to think about our workforce. It gave me a perspective to think about our guests. And then Terence makes this introduction, and lo and behold, he has done some research in there. So, Terence, I was sort of hoping two things. First of all, can you give us a little bit of background of your career? And I know you're in the Philippines right now, but you were in Hong Kong. So a little bit about your background. And then How come you're doing something with senior technology?
Okay. Well, Rob, I've been in the business for quite a while, to put it mildly. And for those of you that don't know, I started my career as a chef, and then I transitioned ultimately to hospitality management and eventually into hospitality IT, where for the last 24 years I've been doing IT consulting back to various clients. People always ask me, how did you make the transition from being a chef to technology? And I say, well, I just playing with different chips. Um, and the, what I made this move into, let's call it age tech or senior living, a few years ago when I got involved in a project in Hong Kong. I was called back to help my first client, in fact, having started my consulting business. And she was involved in a senior living project. And she said, I'd like you to come and help me to put it together. And it was a fascinating area because I realized at that time that there is a real crossover between hospitality and senior living. The main difference is between those two areas that, of course, your average length of stay is different. In hotels, we say it's 1 night, 2.5 nights, or whatever, but in the senior living space, it's years, decades.
People
Um,
might say you check in, but you only check out one way. That's probably a bad
well,
joke.
yeah,
Never mind.
we have this phrase: "You come in the front, but you leave at the back," and it's a horrible phrase, but it's it's a sad fact in many cases. But anyway,
But that also does, by the way, point out the challenges of looking at technology in that sector
yeah,
because as a person ages, things are going to change.
yes. And I think what you also have to remember is that what we now consider to be the aged people, in some countries, if you're 60, you're already classified as being a senior. Um, and those seniors who are 60 years old have been involved with tech for the last 10, 20, 30 years of their life. And they are used to it. And when they maybe move out of their house and they move into a facility, you've got to make that comparable to the existence that they had at one time in their home. The difference is that it's got to be really simple and easy to use. It's got to be intuitive, and of course, it's got to support the operation. And one of the things that I was kind of negative towards when I was doing hospitality projects was voice activation. But I came to realize that for when you're talking about a senior living or an aged care facility, actually voice activation is quite a good thing because you don't have to teach someone how to use the remote control, how to use this switch or whatever. You just make a voice command and it gets done. So there was a home for that there. So there is a crossover between hospitality and senior living or aged care. And as I say, that one of the main differences is how long you keep a guest and how intense the care of that individual has to be during a 24-hour cycle. Unlike a guest who go to bed and you forget about them until breakfast the next morning or whatever, when you're doing that, they really are putting their life into your hands.
Well, actually, if you think about this, I appreciate your giving the background in there as well. So I want to just take a step back. Starting your career as a chef, and actually also moving into, and I completely forgot about this, into the POS side, which may have been that transition from being a cook. I don't want to say cook, but a chef into technology with Romanco, which I'm not sure how many of our listeners actually remember Romanco, but I do.
Yeah.
And we have some commonality there. Gives you a unique perspective of how you're going to service the guest that's there. So my guess is that as you're looking at this and you're asked to do this project, um, your perspective is different because your perspective is not just from all your years of consulting, how to provide better technology to enhance a guest experience, but you also could take a look at it from the back of the house of how do you need to service someone service or maybe employ a senior citizen using technology?
Yeah, if I look at POS or food service in an aged care facility, you've got a resident who lives with you 7 days a week. You're providing them 3 meals a day, 4 meals a day, snacks, whatever it is. You can't keep serving them the same food every day. They've got to have a varied menu. So you've really got to work with the catering department, the purchasing department, and whatever to do this planning, this menu planning, unlike a restaurant in a hotel or a standalone restaurant where you're serving pretty much the same thing every day, maybe with a few specials. In an aged care facility, you've really got to vary that. Otherwise, they're just going to get fed up and want to go elsewhere. So, point of sale, yes, we use that extensively because in many cases, you have the facility of a guest to choose off of a menu. You give them a few options. So you go tableside ordering like you would and say, okay, I want to have the soup, the chicken salad and the custard pudding for dessert. But the other thing you have to remember is that when you're taking care of their diets as part of their care program, you have to only be able to allow them to order what is part of their profile. So, in other words, if they're on a low sodium, low sugar, low cholesterol, whatever, then you have to have the menu items to support that and the whole process at the back.
But if you think about that, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's where our industry can draw from what goes on in other industries. So you really have a mix here. I think you've pointed out a couple things, and I don't want these bullet points to be lost. Senior care facilities today, whether they're independent living, whether they're assisted living or full service, at least in the assisted and the independent, I have an elderly mother-in-law, and she is in a facility today. When I walked in to look at this, I thought I walked onto a cruise ship because, you have centralized dining. Well, not just because of the age of the people that you often see on cruise ships, but just because the dining room looked like it might, and the bars and things, and they did have point of sale. They did have menus that were there. However, you have just introduced something that most people might not think about, that hospitals for years have had to deal with giving the patient, the right types of foods, for their diet, low sodium, no sodium, whatever it might be. And that is an additional piece that today most food and beverage operations don't think about unless they're dealing with food allergies, which in fact are becoming more and more mandated, that you're able to address what's in the food. So you're really introducing several different things here if you talk about the food.
Yeah, and it's not only that, Rob, because what you have to do is not only offer the resident a choice based upon their meal plan or their diet plan or whatever it is, you also have to record what they had, what they ate at every meal. And that will go into their, let's call it guest history, so that when they come to have a medical checkup or whatever it is, then the doctor or the physician or whatever is able to go back and review the history of that resident over a period of time. I mean, they may come in and their cholesterol is high and they're sort of saying, why is my cholesterol high? And the doctor reviews what they've eaten and they can see they've only eaten high cholesterol stuff for the last couple of months. And so it plays a very important part, not only in giving them the selection, but also recording what they had. And just one other thing that I want to touch on here is that, for example, when you have somebody, and you mentioned your mother-in-law, when you have somebody in this kind of facility, you normally set up what we call a care circle. That's close friends, family, people who are responsible for that person staying in that facility, if a guardian, for example. And so those people would be able to look at the system, given the right authority levels. They could look remotely into the system in the facility to say, yes, my mom had the soup for lunch, she had the chicken for dinner, and she had a cup of tea in the afternoon or wherever it is. So you can really do a lot with that information relevant to the care of a particular resident.
Well, see now, there you go again. So you just went ahead and you actually just introduced a new subject, which might be called data security and privacy. But I tell you what, let's just take a break for a second. I'd like to dive into that and some specific things and examples that you just brought up. But as I always tell our listeners, if you're like me and constantly exploring, seeking, I'm going to say like me and like Terrence, exploring, seeking, and feeding a passion for technology and innovation, whether for work or other industries or our industry, and it makes you just sort of say, wow, or that's an interesting subject. Please take a picture, a video, send a link, or just pass me an email at coolideas@robertgrimes.com, because that is how we explore, learn, and share and start that conversation. And sometimes they end up like today on Accelerate. And speaking of Accelerate, to subscribe, or if you have any thoughts, comments, or suggestions, please send a note to our producer at accelerate@savor.fm, SAVOR.fm. So going back to the subject. So, Terrence, you're bringing up a whole number of different things. Like the last one you just brought up with is that it is a care circle. That's it. By the way, that's a new term for me. So I'm now, please, writing that down. But a care circle, that there are others involved in it. And it's not like when you go to a hotel or a restaurant, it's just you. Maybe you post your experience, up on Yelp, or you post an experience out there, online. But it's different because there are people actually involved in making decisions and things. So where does data security and data privacy come in there? Or is it stricter? Is it, what are the considerations of connecting others into the, I want to say guest experience, but into the customer experience?
Yeah, the health industry has some of the strictest data protection rules under HIPAA. Um, and there's not much come, even GDPR and stuff like that probably doesn't come that close. So you have to conform to those standards. And so what happens is when you do set up this care circle, that, like I said, maybe 2 or 3 people, it could be a spouse, a child, or a relative, or whoever it is, okay, then there has to be some authorization process which takes place that allows that particular person to access a certain amount of information about what happens with that resident. Um, and that would be things like, did that, they have an appointment today to go to see the hairdresser? Did they actually turn up for the hairdresser? Have they taken their meds today at certain times? Have they done their PT, their physiotherapy? Have they had lunch? What did they have for lunch? All these kind of things can be fed back to that person or people within the care circle, so they can monitor their mother-in-law, for example, or their spouse that's inside this facility, and know exactly what is going on. And that also provides some governance and oversight about the operation back, and exposes what they're actually doing in that case.
Well, but if you have something where people boy, I mean, you've really got me thinking here, because if we tie your experience between hotels, restaurants, and then what you're looking at for seniors, I realize that seniors take day trips from these places, so they're dining.
Yep.
Okay. Some of the places they're taking overnight trips, but also the senior traveler, people are staying healthy longer and they're traveling, yet they have certain limitations. And we've already pointed out that voice, is one way to get around certain limitations that are there. So are we going to start to see uh, the integration of systems that might be used within senior living and senior care into the hospitality industry, both restaurants and hotels?
It's possible, although the restaurant industry and hotels is much more transient. You've got a much larger footfall than what you have within the senior living functions, and the senior living also has a different um, accountability process. So everything within a senior living facility is done based on billing. You have this, you pay for it. You have that, you pay for it. You do, it's everything. There's a charge for it, and it either goes back to the HMO, or to whoever is the insurance provider.
Well,
So
that's the same thing in a hospital, right? But you
yeah,
also can
exactly,
have full
exactly,
service plans, right?
exactly,
So,
exactly,
like a college
exactly.
or a university.
Yes, although hospitals are not exposing, for example, back to a care circle like they would do within a senior living facility. So there's a much greater community side to it. But you're absolutely correct. Yes, they do go on trips. They do go to restaurants. They go shopping. They do all sorts of stuff like that, and that's encouraged because it keeps them active, rather than they just stay in their room or within the confines of the building, to actually do that. So all of those things are logged, put in a system, so you can imagine the breadth and the depth of a customer profile is far greater than the profile that you would see within a hotel or even a restaurant.
Well, let me. I'd like to break this down into two areas because, based upon your experience in multiple industries and some of these observations, so a do we see the hospitality industry slash, let's say, cruise ships? Do we see them employing certain types of technologies that could be used within senior living itself? Which, by the way, many of those organizations are actually run by companies that provide food service or hospitality. I mean, companies like Marriott and Hyatt used to be in the senior living, a business. So there are many companies that operate in senior living, but they also do hospitality or food service. So, are there some learnings to be had where hospitality is taking the way, realizing that they have a aging traveler, which is a whole piece in itself that could be used within the senior living, and then the converse side of this, which is what should they be looking at that's being used in senior living, where that innovation takes place?
Yeah, a couple of crossover technologies, for example, would be one is, say, the task management system. So, somebody reports something that needs to be fixed. So that is one of the technologies that maybe came out of hotels, and you're seeing that in senior living. Another big tech, of course, is Wi-Fi. That's a huge thing now within senior living. Before, they weren't putting much networking stuff into these buildings. There was no real Wi-Fi, maybe in common areas. Now it has to be everywhere. So they're really going out and investing into that kind of stuff, as well as to support the systems that sit on top of the network. You've got housekeeping management systems, you've got inventory management systems, you've got recipe management systems, those kind of things that maybe started in hotels or restaurants, you're now seeing within senior living. Um, I think from a hospitality point of view, hotels are talking a lot these days about what they call hyper personalization, where they're really trying to make that individual guest feel very special by doing something on a very personal level. But it's complex. It's very difficult because that person is only with you for a very short period of time. And the investment of tech into that is quite
But
considerable.
doesn't that cross over the line if you think about casinos and you think about high end resorts and
Sure,
people where they're doing loyalty or they're not loyalty, where they're tracking guest preferences down
sure.
to what fruit to put in the basket? Isn't that hyper personalization?
Yes, yes. In fact, you mentioned about fruit. A story from a long time ago. I don't want to use up too much of our time. A story from a long time ago. I used to regularly stay in a hotel, and I got fruit baskets. It was a wonderful fruit basket, and they had stuff in there that I didn't want, like an orange. I don't want to eat an orange in my hotel room because it smells and it's all sorts of messy. I said, just give me bananas. That's simple. That's all I want. And from the time I told the hotel, I just got a bunch of bananas in my room, and that was great because it worked. But we have been trying this for some time within hospitality. We're doing a better job than we have done in the past. But it is a lot of those high end hotels, as you mentioned, the casinos, for example, because you're dealing with high rollers of greater, much larger amounts of money, than what you would be seeing at the lower end of the scale. That they'll do that type of thing.
Well, but also, if you're in a market that is controlled in cost, which healthcare certainly is, and senior living would be, the way to get customers, because I see this firsthand, is through those extra amenities, through that personalization and additional services. And yes, they can charge for it, and some people want it. And people are coming to expect it. The senior living center of 20 years ago looks nothing like the ones today.
Sure,
Yeah,
sure. Now, I mean, there are different packages that people will buy into when they move into a senior living facility. It's not that they're all going to have housekeeping every day and every meals, all this kind of stuff. Um, but then there are those places, and you've mentioned, you've given examples of some of those. Some of them I've seen myself in the US and Japan, where I remember walking into one place in Japan. I thought, hang on, I feel like I'm in the Ritz Carlton here. Um,
absolutely.
and the residents, and they were like 99% women, because of course women live longer than men. Um, and they were all dressed up in kimonos, in expensive suits, and they're walking around this place, and they've got their shopping bags, and they're sitting down in the restaurants having tea. And I thought, am I really in a senior living facility or what? Um, and it was very, very impressive how these places operate. But of course,
And there are a lot of
detail.
communities that people want to live in a senior community just by
Yes,
age, but it's not
yes,
senior living. But it's the first
yes,
step, right?
yes, because they want to be with their own people, kind of thing. That when they talk about their stories, people understand what the story is about, and having lived through similar life experiences. Absolutely.
So let me pose a couple of questions for you, because these were my learnings coming out of CES, or let's call them the aha moments that I had. But um, I think there's some challenges here, and I'm curious as to what you think about them. So you said at the very top of the conversation that one of the things is voice, that is a universal thing, and that can go out there. But what do you do when a senior has had a stroke? Or they've had, something that actually or multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's, where they start to have speech problems. Now, my learning was that some of the voice translation could be adapted for that, but yet it's not as easy as just straight language to language. So, how do you accommodate for that, or for hearing issues, or for eyesight issues when you're trying to use these technologies?
You're absolutely correct. And there are a lot of companies out there who are doing huge research into adapting those technologies for those type of unfortunate individuals, because of the market out there, and of course, helping them. It's not all about profit, but it's also about helping those people. But I think the main concentration of tech development within the senior living space is based upon the very horizontal and general requirement. One of those things that's really important is fall detection. Unfortunately, seniors are prone to falling, and it becomes serious if you're elderly and you fall down. So there are now a lot of companies who are developing these fall detection systems, either by giving somebody a bracelet or a necklace, or having certain sensors within the unit itself,
Well,
with
those
a monitor.
applications are also available on the phones that they're carrying with them.
Yes, yeah,
And we didn't really actually talk about the connected senior, because as things move along here, they're now coming into these centers with devices, the tablets and things that 10 years ago it was a flip phone. And so there, some of those things can actually be built into the software that they're carrying with them, just like we're
absolutely,
trying to connect with the guest, right? But
absolutely, absolutely.
you do have to take into account these sorts of aging challenges, which doesn't mean that they're not able to take the service. They just may not be able to communicate effectively, or understand, or see, or read, or hear.
Sure, sure, sure. That is a problem, and I don't specifically have an answer for that at this moment. But it is. What I do know is that these are areas that are being looked into. One of the other things that's now coming about is to put robots inside these units, because they have this thing called a companion robot. One of the huge thing about seniors is to be lonely, and they sit there in isolation for many hours a day, and they go into this funk type of mood. And I was working with one robot provider, and we were looking at using these. That it was like a small little robot that sits on a table with inside the room, and the resident can communicate with it, talk to it, and but what it does is it can actually monitor the facial characteristics and the head position of the resident. And if the face droops or falls down, dependent on certain algorithms and metrics put into the system, they would monitor that and could send alerts.
So fascinating. So that's where you see a crossover and you start to use your imagination. And see, you just probably pointed out something a lot of people don't think about. Another thing I saw this year at CES was you see these. Well, certainly you see a lot of robotic dogs and pets and things like that, but also used for surveillance in a house where they can go around, but
Yep,
they're monitoring the temperature, they can sense movement, you know, and so those are things we don't think about. But the idea of robots, gosh, not a new idea. I mean, I think of the Tamagotchi, which a lot of people probably have no clue what that is. But
yeah,
in Japan, that's got to be 20 years ago, where
more.
people went ahead and they had, digital pets that they
Yes,
would feed, take care of, and do these things to have companionship. But the idea of taking a robot that not only is going to be your companion, because with AI it can actually have a conversation with you, and monitor at the same time
yeah,
for the family, for the healthcare, what's going on. And there were times that I've known people that fell down or something in their apartment and nobody knew for hours, even though they were checking. So
correct.
what an interesting scene. Now there's an idea. What an interesting thought on
The
that.
other thing talking about robots is, that you obviously some of these seniors need to be reminded to take their medicines. They may take it 3 times a day, whatever.
Exactly.
And we used to we used to experiment with the idea of putting alerts onto the robot or onto a phone, take your medicine, whatever. And I came up with the idea one day that what we should be doing is that, let's say grandma is in a facility, okay? Now, grandma won't listen to everybody when you give her an instruction, because that's just how she is.
Oh,
She'll fob it up,
right.
and won't even listen to the nurse. I said, well, let's find somebody within her group of friends or her relatives to make the recording for us that we'll play on the robot. And it could be a grandchild. So what we were doing was we were experimenting with the child, the grandchild, could be a grandson, granddaughter, whatever, that at the time that it was time to take the medication, a video would come up or a greeting say, hey, grandma, have you taken your medication today? I want to make sure you're okay, kind of thing. And because of that, they would associate with the grandchildren thinking, oh, I must follow them because this is the right thing for me to do. And they would take their medicine.
So I can see how this is going to go. So this actually will end up being a conversation you and I will have either over a beer or a Cuban cigar, because what you just said, my mind starts going this. I say, wait a second, as people start ordering remotely, as people start having an experience after they left, maybe they have, a favorite housekeeper, a favorite server, a favorite, I don't know what. And why now, let's not even bother getting into the challenges of, AI and, capturing somebody's, voice and using it in improper ways. Let's think the positive ways here, that you can continue to have that relationship, even if you're ordering online with your favorite server. Or, I get it, that the family member who they're used to hearing from and that they relate with, even if they have memory problems,
That's right.
long-term memory. What a great idea. Boy, I could go down the rabbit hole on this, because you actually could have people that aren't even around anymore, because I think of seniors who have lost a spouse,
Yep.
and they can continue to they can continue to have a relationship and be comforted by that from a
Sure,
voice instead
sure.
of just a picture. So you've opened up, by the way, that would be going down the rabbit hole. You've opened it up, but that is exactly why we're talking. So in just to sort of wrap this up a little bit, what would your recommendations be? Twofold. One is, what is the impact on the staff? What should they be thinking about, in these technologies, and how should they be reacting? And then what's your takeaway, as to, the few messages that you might want, the bullet points that you might want people to think about as they're thinking about implementing technologies to support a senior customer in hospitality, food service, retail, any of those industries?
Okay. So yeah, you bring up a good point about staff, and staffing in a senior living facility is as hard as it is within hospitality. There's a huge shortage of people out there, especially when you're talking about qualified people. But then there are those people who will stay and work in the senior living facility because they get attached to the resident, and they'll stay with them for 10 years, 15 years, or whatever. What we were doing was, now we were enabling those staff with mobile devices, and those mobile devices basically were a gateway or a window onto the resident, so that they could look up certain things, understand what it was, but at the same time it would be the way to manage their workflow for the day. So it could be that you had a particular member of staff whose responsibility it was to do wound care, because wounds are a big thing also for seniors. So they would go around with their tray and with their mobile device, and they would knock on the door. They'd have a schedule to go in and see auntie and check her wound on her hand or her arm or whatever, take a picture, provide the service, and move on to the next person. But at the same time, built into that device would be the way you actually take care of that wound, how a step by step guide, as being a refresher, or even a video, a short, like a YouTube video on how you treat. So there was always that access to training, guidance of how you do certain things. So bringing all of those processes into a handheld device to handle the workflow. It could be for housekeeping, it could be for room service, it could be for whatever it was going forward. So really trying to enable the staff with a better workflow, and also the control. The difference is, you have to be very careful that you didn't allow those devices to operate outside of the facility, because it contained a lot of proprietary private information. And at the same time, they were not allowed to download or to take that information and pull it onto another system, which of course is always a data privacy issue. The last thing you want to do is to read about somebody's medical records in the newspaper that has been stolen off of one of these systems. So you have to be very careful from that data privacy point of view. But yes, providing tech, providing training aids, keeping the staff mobile is a very important thing within senior living, as much as it is managing the inventory. With a hotel, someone's going to stay 1 night, 2 nights, 3 nights. So it's easy through your PMS, to use the technical term there, to monitor your inventory. When you have a senior living facility, you really don't know how long that person is going to stay with you. Is it going to be weeks, months, years? So how to manage your inventory of rooms going forwards is a challenge as well.
Well, listen, I want to thank you for joining us. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that I expect to see Terence in about a month and a half from now at High Tech, the hotel industries, the HFTP, the Hospitality, Financial, and Technology Professionals annual global technology conference, where Terence has been nominated for an HFTP Hospitality Technology Hall of Fame Award. And I think that based on this conversation, you can understand why. And of course, the definition of hospitality is broad, and I think that Terence fits all of those different areas. So, Terence, I really appreciate you joining us today on Accelerate and sharing not only your thoughts on the senior living area, but also your perspective on the hospitality and food and beverage areas as well. And also, I don't want to really keep you much longer from that fizzy water and the cigars, the Cuban cigars.
Thank you, Rob. I'm actually sniffing the cigar now, thinking it's about time to light up.
There you go. So with that, thank you for joining us. This podcast is brought to you by the International Food and Beverage Technology Association. The IFBTA is the industry's voice of technology within food and beverage, providing thought leadership as a single, impartial, and go-to resource. The IFBTA offers in-person and online communities to connect with your peers, the exchange an all-encompassing global technology directory, and an industry-wide professional education and certification program. The bottom line, the IFBTA is your place to gather, learn, and share. So thank you for joining us on this episode of Accelerate, powered by the IFBTA. I'm Rob Grimes, your host, and I look forward to our next accelerated conversation together.